reviewing some of that information and kind of mining down a little deeper. So before we take off any further, see if there's any comments or maybe something that someone found or some information you'd like to share or comments about, kind of what we talked about last week. We ran out of time, or we would have been able to have a little more discussion. And so I wanted to open that up before we move forward, if there was any comments or anything on 1 Timothy chapter 5 regarding widows or widows indeed, enrolled widows or... Okay. Well, let's just take off then. Let's start in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 17. It says, "Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially they who labor in the word and doctrine." So what is double honor? Okay, so the first part of the chapter talks about honoring widows, honoring or showing respect to older people, actually everybody, showing respect to everybody really, whether it's old to young, young to old, and shows how you deal with each other. Then it talks about widows and honoring them. And then we come down here and then it talks about double honor. So we have the normal honor and respect, but then on top of that you have double, which the context really helps clarify that. There might be some discussion about it if we didn't have the next verse that really shows what's being discussed and what double means. When we're talking about elders in verse 17, we are definitely dealing with the presbyteros, which is those that have been appointed by the Holy Spirit through the qualifications in 1 Timothy 3, Titus chapter 1, 1 Peter chapter 5, and Hebrews. Also, so these are individuals that have been appointed, that met the qualifications, that are serving as shepherds over a local flock. And he says those that rule well can be counted worthy of double honor. And he's dealing with the double portion would be financial compensation, especially they who labor in word and doctrine. So those that are giving special and additional time in service, in laboring in the word, and also in teaching or instruction. That is doctrine. In verse 18, "For the Scripture saith," and it quotes, from the Old Testament. He says, "Thou shalt not muzzle an ox that treadeth out the corn, and the laborer is worthy of his reward." So you can see a little bit, just even from the context there, that it is identifying what that double portion is. In Luke chapter 10 and in verse 7, we have at least the statement, "The laborer is worthy of his hire," found in Luke chapter 10 and in verse 7. But here, it's referencing even Old Testament principles that are found. And we were talking a little bit about what that meant, I think, last time. If you've got those animals, they used to use animals, and before you had the animals that were going around and were hooked to a harness and that were moving a stone. That would be a mill, to try to mill and move that stone around over another stone, one above, one below, and then you would put those in and it would sit there and it would roll around, and this heavy, heavy stone would crush the corn, right? And then make your meal. But before they had that, a very simplified form of this would be that you would use what would be similar to a threshing floor, something where it's very hard, a surface that is very hard, and then you would just have the animals walk over it. So if you didn't have anything else and all you had was those animals, then you could have them sit there and just walk over it. They go around and around in a circle, and they're using their hoofs and their weight, and they would just literally walk on it. And that would suffice, and it would do the same. And so that's, what we see here. So he says, you don't muzzle an ox that treadeth out the corn. If you put a muzzle on it, it's not able to eat, and so you're going to work it, and it's not able to receive of its bounty. It's not able to then eat some of that as it goes along. And so you're working it to death without providing any nourishment for it. And so that's the principle that is given from the Old Testament and also over here. And so he says then it is right then to do so. And then he says the laborer is worthy of his reward. And so it is appropriate for elders who serve in this capacity, who labor in the word and in doctrine, then to receive that double honor, and that would be financial compensation for their effort and for their time. Why? Because the laborer is worthy of his reward. So we'll pause there. Any comments on those two verses before we move forward?
Then they're moving well, and that constitutes they need to be reimbursed for it. But some that are just offices of the church that really are not involved, I don't think that. And also, the double honor, there are some evangelist preachers who also serve as elders, and so their means of support is through being paid the labor deserves the wages. So I think how much work we're doing for the church, and does it prohibit them from having a particular job? If it does, then they certainly deserve to be reimbursed.
Somebody's alarm's going off, by the way. It's across the street. Okay. All right. So that's exactly right, Brother Mike, and appreciate those comments. Not only do you have, potentially someone who is a shepherd of the flock, who also serves as a minister, and so in that case, or in some places, it is the hired minister who is then appointed as an elder, which happens more frequently than not. It actually goes in the reverse because it's somebody that is not from the local area, but somebody that has been moved to that local area because they've been hired to serve in that capacity, and they begin serving and working, and then because they are qualified, the congregation is looking to appoint elders, and that person is appointed, and so then the preacher, who is a full-time preacher, then also serves as an elder, as a shepherd, and so in that case, your preacher then would be a pastor. And you have that happen sometimes, on occasion. I know my father has served in that capacity at times, and also other family members as well. So then you also have, if it's just a shepherd, just an elder, but then who, again, dedicates that time and who is giving and devoting that time, and it might be that even that individual is retired, but then they dedicate their full time to this, and laboring and working in this, and there would be compensation for that. So it is right. How often, maybe I'll ask this question just because I don't know, so I'm going to poll you guys. How often have you heard of, or you are aware of congregations where it is just simply the shepherd who then receives double honor, who is receiving a compensation from the church for service? Maybe you can raise your hand if you're aware of that. Wow, so it's just one? I'm aware of several, but I was just curious about for you guys. I know of a bunch of different congregations that have that. It can be beneficial, and there was a one. Yeah, I'm not talking about the preacher per se. I'm just speaking of where this is a shepherd who certainly shepherds are to be apt to teach and do teach. So I'm not, and would those individuals on occasion would be filling the pulpit, would be teaching classes, but they're just shepherds. They're not per se the located minister who's been brought in for that work, and they receive compensation for that. So I'm just curious if any of you are aware of that. But this is something that the Bible does say is scriptural, and it is appropriate as it is scriptural and as it is appropriate. in some places it can cause issues, let's say for, yeah, I like that. It's better than some other ringtones I've heard. So, so it is scriptural, but in some places I know that it has caused some maybe tension, not necessarily troubles or problems, but some tension, because sometimes in elderships, instead of a cohesive functioning group where the group sits down and makes decisions and then it is the decision of the group, the eldership, then sometimes you have somebody, especially if they are full-time and are aware of more of those issues, then they would be then not by name and not on purpose, but sometimes by default would then be what we would call chief elder. And that can give issue on occasion. It not always has happened in that way, but in some places that has caused a little bit of strife or tension. And so, there has to be, if a person is compensated in this way and they're giving more of their time to that, then they're still subject to the eldership. So there is still no chief elder, even if they're dedicated. Let's say you have 2 elders, one of them is full-time and receiving compensation, one of them is not, then the one that's all the time working and receiving compensation is still subject to the group, to the eldership. Or even if it's 2 others that are not compensated, one is compensated, they're still subject to the group. Because an elder is always subject to the eldership. Independent elders, again, not having authority of their own, they have authority of the group. And but again, this is a biblical precedent. It is appropriate. The Bible teaches this. Why would Paul teach this?
Does it not, and I haven't thought through this, so I'm sure I'm not going to say it properly, but if the office of an eldership is for hire, how are you certain that you're going to get a hireling rather than somebody that's caring for the church? So if it becomes a job, does the money, First Timothy 3:3 says one of the qualifications of elders shouldn't be greedy of filthy lucre.
Correct.
So if it's for a job, it seems like you risk of someone becoming a politician because of pay rather than doing what's right because money's involved. Money is the love of money.
Love of money.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess maybe it seems like we don't have elders paid as much is because how do you know if they're hiring, if they're just coming in for money, or if they're actually performing the work that elders should be performing? And I hadn't thought that through, so it probably didn't come out right.
No, you could see that, that if I guess the passage, it strikes me, is saying if you have one that is doing this, then they are worthy of being compensated. Instead of the flip side, which is we're going to advertise the compensation for this position and then we're going to have people politic to get it. Whereas it may be the flip side, but yeah, I mean, I could see your point, but you could say the same thing about gospel preachers. That every gospel preacher who receives compensation is a hireling. And I have received that criticism, but I think it's clear that the apostles, even Paul says on occasion, he provided his support by his own hands, and other times he received it from outside, where he was being provided support from outside. So, but some people will make that claim, but then they would not sacrifice and make the sacrifices it takes to actually be a gospel preacher who not necessarily have a home and has to move with the whim of congregations or brethren. So they wouldn't take their family and uproot them at the sneeze of a congregation and continue to do it. So there's a lot of people that make comments like that. Not to say that you're saying that, Brother Mike, but there are those specifically about the position of evangelists that would say, that all compensated evangelists are hirelings. That's not necessarily true. But it doesn't mean that there aren't some that are, which is what you're making, the point that you're making. And so it is challenging. But I do think you're driving a good point home here that if you look back at the qualifications, It does say that they cannot be greedy. Greedy of filthy lucre, that is not a quality that they have. And I guess if you were to advertise that this was the case, then and then somebody was politicking to get the position, you're wondering if they've done that because they desire the work or if they have greed for the funds. So yeah, I will say this, I think it is a good policy, though it's not done in many congregations, for the eldership to sit down and agree themselves to provide reimbursement for expenses that are performed by of service of elders. You know, it's not done in this congregation, but I'll say this: it would be a good thing if it's hard for elders to do that, because then the elders are having to decide that they're going to receive reimbursement for expenses that they use, which would mean if they had a large group in their home or they did it regularly, that they were able to turn in the receipts for that. If they not only on top of that, but if they were to travel and visit, that they would return in their receipts for gas, especially lately. Then I think that would be appropriate. For actual work activity, that they would be able to be reimbursed, and so in that way, for the work itself, and so it wouldn't be so much that it would be to be for wages, but it would be rather a reimbursement for expenses. I think that definitely would be something that would be appropriate. Other comments? Yeah, he's the chief shepherd. Well, he didn't have to receive food from others. He could look out on a crowd and say, "You guys are hungry, and so am I." We're feeding everybody. There's a feast for all. So but you're right. Yeah, from that standpoint of even when he saw that there was a misuse of funds, and we talked about that with the overturning of the money changers and some corruption that was taking place there. Where they had turned something that was a very spiritual thing into something that was not, and had corrupted that. But yeah, that's it. Again, I'll go back to the question: why is this here? He's writing, he's bebopping along, and he's talking about honor, and then all of a sudden, shepherds can get paid. I mean, that's what we're saying. That's what the text says. If they work and they labor in word and doctrine, they can get paid. And that's in layman's terms. So why? You're riding along. We're talking about. Well, I mean, if you look at the whole of the book, and he's dealing with a young evangelist, and this young evangelist is certainly going to be working with various groups and trying to establish them in the faith, and he's starting to deal with the organization of the church. And he's talked about the structure of the church and the worship of the church and who should be leading and who should not, who's in a leadership role, who is not. Then he talks about the organization from the elders. He talks about deacons. He talks about evangelists. And then he talks about providing this respect and honor for each other as all Christians. And then dealing with making sure that we take care of those that are helpless or those that have need regarding those that are widows and that stand in need of that. And then in the midst of all of this, he says, and by the way, not only can we financially help those that are widows indeed, but we can also pay, we're talking about how funds are used, we would say, within the body of Christ and the congregation of the church, and we can also use those funds to compensate a shepherd who rules well and then who labors in word and doctrine. So I think that's there's a flow as he's, going along. I think that's the connection. What do you guys think? It just makes sense to me. We're talking about how they're using funds, dealing with helping and financially helping out widows in different circumstances, whether he's talking about the role of somebody that's providing a service or just helping people that are destitute and in need. And then he also uses this to say also we can use funds for this. I don't know, what do you think? Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Right. You know, it's interesting, at least in his explanation. I know he's going from one line of thought to the other, which is if there's work being done, then that person is worthy to feed. Let's put it that way. You got an animal that's working, it's appropriate to feed. It's inappropriate. It's abuse if you don't. You work them hard, you don't provide any food for the animal, you're abusing them. That's the principle that is laid down. And so he's saying here you've got a shepherd who's working hard, it's appropriate to take care of them. You know, if we're just looking at from the take care principle, you've got those that can be taken care of in chapter 5, and here's another one where we have another that we can take care of and provide help, support. We put financial compensation or wages, and boy, that changes the way we view it. But ultimately, we're saying here we have an appropriate means of providing help to an individual who's doing the work. That they're worthy of receiving it. Not that they have to, but they're worthy of receiving this.
Is rule well a relative term? Is it a subjective term? Is it an objective term? Is there who determines? It's not like if I go to work, I have a job description.
Mm-hmm.
And when I make my job description and I do it well, then it's determined that I'm doing my job well.
Mm-hmm.
When they're ruled well, how is that determined? There's no criteria that I know other than doing the work with eldership, and depending on which congregation you go to, it can be a lot of different things. So a lot of work or no work. So it's like, who determines that one rule is well?
Well, Scripture, I think, definitely lays down, we talked about, not only do you have qualifications, but you have the work of, and it is a work. He says those that desire it desire a good work, and it is a work. And then when you look at the role and what has been given, not only oversight, not only we have decision making. All decisions have to be made. When you're dealing outside of those things that are directly commanded, then you have those other areas of option that have to be decided upon, and then the elders then rule in that sphere over a congregation. But when you look at the word shepherd and feed, which is one man, and you look at the word that derives from it, which is to feed the flock, then you see a different part of shepherding. As we've seen shepherds, it says that, you leave the 99 behind, you go after the one, bring back the one. So there's a certain aspect of care, concern, trying to look after the flock. You're protecting the flock from false teachers. You're protecting them from harm. You're protecting them from wolves in sheep's clothing. So the shepherd has that role. The shepherd also has the role of making sure if there's a wandering away sheep, they go and get it, they bring it back. They don't let it just wander away and stay with the 99. You have, there's just so many facets of that. Shepherds also have a leading role in church discipline when there are those that refuse. Then that would be all. Yeah, it's just not that. It's not just that particular thing, but it would be all. Absolutely. You got a point. You have a point.
they feel like they have, so they take on the office of elder. To me, the reason to say that if you're going to pay the elder, then it says they have to do well, live with honor, and they labor in the word and doctrine. So to me, it seems reasonable to think that not necessarily all elders would fit into that category. As being elders with laboring in the word and doctrine, not saying that all our elders don't do that, but maybe it's like the widow that was making an extra effort to be enrolled. She was taking a specific work. You could be a widow and meet the qualifications to be enrolled. Or maybe you serve in a different way. You're just not dedicated to a certain purpose like the elder or maybe you have elders that serve as elders and serve as good elders and everything's fine, but maybe they don't take on that maybe evangelistic role or preacher role or whatever it is, the labor and word or doctrine. And so, it's okay to not pay them if they don't want to be paid, kind of way I see it. But also, I think it makes sense, like, if you're going to pay them, the elder's making $50,000 a year, he said, I'm giving up a job, and I was making $50,000 a year. He says, but in order for me to be an elder, I need to make $250,000 a year. And we understand that that doesn't make sense. So, you need to be paid so that you can free up your time. You need to be reasonable to what you have before. To me, I think it's not there, but like you said, an elder can't be free, filthy loser. So I think that's the way I would approach it. My opinion.
Yeah, that's right. And he does go into that dealing with some of the funds and money and your attitude toward it. So that's exactly right. Sure. Mm-hmm. No, it's not like an advertised position, right? Right. Could be. So you have. Thank you everybody for your comments. So you have this situation. I think and Adam was kind of hitting from verse 17. Those that rule well are the ones to receive double honor are those that labor in the word and doctrine, and are specifically. He says especially. It doesn't mean that they are, but he says especially those that are doing this. So he gives this an example of elders that are performing their position. They're performing as an elder well, but they also are giving extra time and diligence in the area of laboring and working in the word and in doctrine on top of everything else. I would say, the work of an elder, there's a lot of work to be done just as an elder if you didn't add the additional laboring in word and doctrine before the flock. I mean, there's tons of work to be done just with the normal work that is there, the normal workload. So to add that in addition, I think that is definitely a qualifier. It doesn't have to be because it says especially. He's just saying, it's just like it's good to do. Let me try that again. Let us do good unto all men, especially those of the household of faith. So you have the especially. We have the right to do good unto all men, but especially those of the household of faith in Galatians chapter 6, verse 10. The question is, can an elder be part-time? And I know what Wallace is meaning. Like, in an eldership, we don't have part-time elders. They're just elders. You're just talking about the qualification. I think in congregations that I have known where they have elders that spend the majority of time away and not at the congregation, then they eventually step down. And that's either by them and that's their decision because they can't do the work, or it's by the request of the elders, of the eldership, to say, you're not here enough to even shepherd the flock. And so I would say no from that standpoint. And of course, that I've known elders that were away, like the majority of time for work or what have you. And so that was causing some issues. So then they had to step down because they were not present. And that was hindering them from actually being a shepherd of the flock. How can you shepherd the sheep when you aren't even around them all, once every now and then? You're not really, serving as a shepherd. Right, right. And I would say, you have elders that definitely are on call 24 hours, just like the preacher, generally on call. I get, you guys don't know this, but I get calls at 2 in the morning. Come get me, come help me, whatever, and that's okay. There's some of those instances, those individuals need help, and they reached out, and that's fine. That's okay. But like you said, if the sheep have a need, then you're there to be there for individuals.
It seems like it would just change the church entirely if we paid our Bible class teachers. We have some great Bible class teachers that really work hard. Well, let's pay them. Let's pay the deacons. Let's pay the. And I know there's places that do these, pay the song leaders or whatever. But I don't know. It just seems like the church is purchased by the blood of Christ, and we owe something to the church. And when we start doing it for money, it may or may not. I've known elders that's robbed and stolen before from the church. I know that for a fact, personally. So it's not, money can cause people to do a lot of things, and it can influence our attitude toward the church, and realizing that we have salvation through Christ. He purchased the church with his blood, and we owe the congregation and the church something. And that's just my opinion. Don't cost anything. It's free of charge.
Right, right. For me, the way that I see it is I have a degree and I can work, but the congregation here doesn't want to let me go and spend all my time doing accounting or taxes or 60 hours a week and, or however many hours. And then I definitely wouldn't have the appropriate time to study as I do, or preparation, or to go visit the hospital, or go different things like that. Just wouldn't have the ability to do those things, or to do Bible studies. And so in order to not do that, then that's the only way that I can work here, is to be able to have that time freed up for that. It doesn't mean that I couldn't. I could. I could work a job, and then I could, we could split the work here. We've got tons of preachers here in this audience, and we could just split the work. And then you don't have to have a located man. Congregations do it. That's okay. But some congregations make the decision to have one person that is located. Of course, that all goes back to discretion and opinion, but ultimately back to the decision of the eldership. But there's nothing wrong with having congregations. Not to say that you have to bind it, that we're a mutual edification congregation only, where that has to be the case, because we believe it's unscriptural to have a located man. But rather, there are congregations that do it. I think I was reading that Dalraida did it. I saw something that came out from Dalraida, and they were saying they had a bunch of different guys that work, but then they just, do different things. Sometimes one will teach, sometimes some will preach, and they just kind of share all the responsibilities. And so I think that that's what they're trying to do, but it's because they have the volume of men capable. Not all congregations are like that. Definitely, it's actually very rare to find congregations where you have enough that could fulfill that capacity. But was that the second or the first? That's the first. Okay. All right. So what other comments? So we have lots of comments. That's good.
Well, I have known, I've been away from this area, and there's been congregations where you didn't have very many people, and I guess in an instance like that, if you leadership, you didn't have any leadership. Maybe that instance would make more sense. In this area, there seems to be so many, so many congregations. I don't know where it would actually even be something that we would ever see in this area. I've never known of it in this area. Maybe somebody in here older than me knows of it in this area. I have never known of it happening in this area.
No.
Of paying for an elder.
Paying an elder, compensating an elder.
Yeah, I've never known of that.
I know of one congregation, well, I know on several, but one congregation in particular, they had one elder that did full time, and he worked over the missions, and he worked with missions, and he dedicated, and he was paid, he was compensated, he was at the office just like he would be at the office. Huh? It's the state of Georgia, so it's in the South, and he was dedicated to missions, and he worked full-time working with that, and that was a particular role that had been designated by the congregation because they needed it. And he not only was a shepherd, but he spent, he was at the office however many, hours a week and worked with all of those components because they had a big program. I know of other congregations as well that have done it. But I think the two that I know of are in Georgia. Where's the one you were talking about? What state? Okay. I think there's another in Tennessee. But yeah, it's not, based on our polling everybody in the audience, it's not very common. But yeah, I could see how that, I think his point is that this could be the right thing to do. Doesn't mean that this is what we're going to try to set up everything and then we're going to try to advertise and pull people in to serve as an elder, but rather if you have one that's already an elder and already plowing the field and just given over an abundance of time and effort and working in this, then it would be appropriate then to reward them. So that is the text. Verse 19 says, against an elder receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, this has to do with, we will pick up there next time, verse 19, and then we'll move forward. We just run out of time. Thank you so much for all your comments. Appreciate them.